If calves don't drink, they're not going to eat. And if they start dehydrating, after weaning, the probability of those calves getting sick goes up pretty significantly.
Weaning is one of the most stressful times in a calf's life, and it's where health, nutrition, and management all collide. So how do you set your calves up for success?
Producers need to utilize a method that kind of fits their management style, their facilities, and their labor resources. And really the goal ultimately is to minimize stress as much as possible for both the cow and the calf.
From management choices to handling methods, every decision is going to make that difference between a smooth transition or a wreck.
Our goal here is really to create a robust immune system in the calf prior to the stresses associated with the weaning process so that they stay healthy.
Dr. Ron Lemenager with Purdue University is my guest as we discuss the keys to successful weaning on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Hi, everyone. This is the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills, your host, and thank you for tuning in to our show here today as we talk on the topic of keys to successful weaning. And I'll tell you right now, if you are at a point where you can jot down some notes, be ready to do that, because we're going to talk about some things today that I think are very, very noteworthy, that will be useful, that you can use later on if you're looking at that. I get it. There's probably some folks probably already past that point here, but there are a lot of folks still yet to be weaning calves, maybe looking at it, weighing the options out, whether they should or should not. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but mostly just kind of some ways, if you do plan on weaning, how you can do that successfully and really get that calf moved on to the next point in their life. That's really what it's coming down to. So be sure to stick around. A great show here today on that. Just real quick, I wanted to let you know, coming up on future episodes of the Working Ranch Radio Show, we're going to be talking about, this one's going to probably create a little bit of stir, but 10 reasons why you should not hay. Boy, I can already tell that that's going to create a little stir, so be sure to tune in for that show coming up. Also, we've got coming up next week, we're going to be talking drones. Not necessarily the type of drones that I've been using here in our ranch operation for, probably 6-7 years. I don't remember when I got my first drone, but these are a little bit bigger. These are more for aerial applications, and we'll talk about how that can be used in the livestock business. So be sure to tune in next week for that. And we're not going to have meteorologist Don Day on this week, but we will next week, and let's see if we can't have him on for a little bit longer, as he's also been kind of talking about what he anticipates the winter to look like. So I want to visit with meteorologist Don Day on that. So be sure to tune in to next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Hey, the next issue of Working Ranch magazine is soon to be coming out, and if you don't have a subscription, it's easy. You can go to the website at workingranchmag.com and you can get your subscription started here today. Or another easy way to get a copy of Working Ranch magazine is to stop by your local Tractor Supply store, and you can pick one right up off the rack here. And shout out to the Tractor Supply store today in Mount Vernon, Illinois, in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, in Plattsburgh, New York, and in Wisconsin Rapids, Michigan. So again, if you want to get your latest copy of Working Ranch magazine, stop by your local Tractor Supply store and you can do that. Well, let's jump into our subject at hand here today. Joining us here on the program as our guest is Dr. Ron Lemenager. He is the Beef Extension Specialist at Purdue University. He's also a rancher, a producer himself. And Dr. Lemenager, good to have you here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Well, it's my pleasure to be joining you.
You bet. When we get into this subject here today is looking at weaning and, of course, everything that involves with that. A lot of it is how we can reduce that stress that comes on these calves. Tell you what, with these cattle markets the way they are, you really need to be thoughtful and very purposeful as you move forward into this time of the year where you're looking at weaning.
I don't think there's any question about it, and if we can add value to these calves at weaning time, when, if you look at the futures markets, feeder calves are $3.50 a pound. And if you look at some of the actually auction markets, some of these calves are selling for well over $4 a pound. So a little bit of feed and a little bit of care on these calves and helping them be healthy going on to the next segment of the industry, I think has some dollars associated with it.
And I even think for us, like for our operation this year, we've typically weaned calves in the past. I think we're looking a little bit at it, whether we do it. But part of it is knowing that I've interviewed Clint Berry with Superior Livestock, and one of the things that he says, if you're good at putting weight on these calves and you can do it, then you should be doing it. If you're not good at it, you might want to rethink whether or not you're going to wean calves. But really, at the end of the day, a lot of it is just being able to monitor these calves, maintain, knowing that they're going to stay healthy. And a lot of that backs up to the process when we get started with weaning, all the way back to those preconditioning shots.
Yeah, I think one of the things that producers need to be really cognizant of, and I know that they do, but sometimes you need to remind them, is to minimize these stresses that are associated with weaning time, mm-hmm. right? And so, if I can get castrations and dehornings and branding and all those things done away from the stress of weaning, that otherwise you just compound all of these to get on top of one another. And I think the other one is that you need to think about pre-weaning vaccinations.
Yeah.
2 to 4 weeks ahead of weaning, give that first round. And then weaning time it makes it kind of convenient to give that booster shot. And I think another thing that kind of helps minimize stress at weaning time is if you think about creep feeding 30 to maybe 60 days before weaning. And I think the value there is, number one, increasing calf weight at weaning time. But maybe as important as anything else is that those calves learn how to eat out of a feed bunk.
Yeah.
And so whenever they do get weaned, they know what a feed bunk is. They know what a pelleted or a textured feed looks like and eats like and tastes like. I think it's also important if you're gonna do that, you add an ionophore to that creep ration, something like a Rumensin. That's the one that I prefer. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit more potent from the standpoint of stabilizing intake of these calves from a day-to-day basis, kind of helping with bloat and acidosis, and the other one is coccidiosis. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a cheap investment with a pretty significant payback. And then the other one that I think is kind of important is that the calves pre-weaning need to be adapted to whatever kind of water resource they're going to have after weaning. Mm-hmm. Okay. So if that's training them to a tank or an automatic water, if they're going to go from a stream or a pond to a tank, they may not understand what mm-hmm. that is mm-hmm. at first. And so, if calves don't drink, they're not going to eat. And if they start dehydrating, after weaning, the probability of those calves getting sick goes up pretty significantly. So those are some of the thoughts that I've got in terms of minimizing weaning stresses.
Yeah.
And then if you go to the weaning process, it's a weaning day. Calves can receive their booster vaccines, be dewormed. And I might throw in there that you might need to treat for flies, at least in some places, all right? So these calves are not kicking at their bellies and, swatting at flies and being irritated in that sort of way. And I think the second one is ideally these calves need to be placed ideally in a grass lot, because dust and dust particles will really aggravate the respiratory problems. That can kind of go with these calves bawling and that kind of thing. And then obviously the grassy lot gives them an opportunity to graze. And so, if you've got your creep feed that you bring forward, so that's part of it. Another part of it is that kind of a long stem grassy hay. All right. Mm-hmm. And so they can graze, they can eat hay, they can eat a weaning ration, which could be your creep feed ration. And that's what I do. The other thing on these grassy lots is I would minimize low spots that can accumulate water, manure, and mud. A lot of times you'll find that under shade trees or under a shade environment. And what you'll find is that these calves can sometimes crowd around each other. So that minimizes airflow. Flies are going to be more of an issue. Heat stress is going to become more of an issue with these cattle crowded together. You'll soften up the bottom of these feet. So you'll get soft hooves and foot rot becomes more of an issue. So, if you can minimize those low spots that accumulate mud in that grassy dry lot that you're going to wean into, I think that's a good thing. Another one is making sure that you've got clean, fresh water, and they understand how to use it. And ideally, you might even set that water supply along the fence line. And if you're using a water tank, maybe you set it perpendicular to the fence, so that as these calves, they're going to do is they're going to walk the fences, right? Right after weaning, they're going to be looking for mom. And so at least they have to walk around the water supply. And so typically they're pretty curious. So they will oftentimes stop and take a drink. And then all of a sudden they understand where the water supply is at. Providing good quality grass hay, free choice. Quite honestly, I like to hand feed it. And the reason I like to hand feed hay is that it kind of gets the calves used to people. And so I think those calves kind of settle down a little bit quicker as a result of that. And then providing a highly digestible fiber, kind of a ration with minimal amounts of grain. So things like soybean hulls and corn gluten feed and distillers grains and wheat midds, kind of all fit into that category. And the idea there is that I really don't want a lot of starch in the diet that can lower the rumen pH and cause acidosis and the associated digestive problems. And so it could be the same feed as your creep feeder. And that's what I do is I move the creep feeder with the calves, put the gates up, and so those calves have access to creep feed that they're accustomed to and the feed bunk that they're accustomed to. Or you can hand feed it in a bunk. That's another one, along with the hay or whatever. But so those are just kind of some thoughts that I have on weaning.
Real quick, a question. You talked about you liked longer stemmed grass hay. I know you have a pretty good background in ruminant nutrition. And my question would be, this year, and I know different parts of the country are experiencing different weather situations. It's been a pretty good chunk of the country that's had some good moisture, seeing some hay that they haven't had before. What about other types of hay? I mean, when you say long stem grass, why do you like that? Or is there some other options if people don't have that available?
Well, when you start adding 50% legume to these hays, those calves are going to get looser.
Okay.
Right? I mean, the manure consistency is going to get looser, and that's going to be a way for those calves to kind of dehydrate. And so I'm a little bit cautious about having a high legume hay. If it's got 30% legume in it, that's probably okay. But, I would be a little bit careful about feeding like a straight alfalfa. The other thing that is baleage. All right. We've got producers in different areas of the country that are using baleage. The problem with that is that that's a fermented feed. Okay. And while it's a tremendously good feed, I have no problem with it as being a feed resource for the cow herd. But, when you've got calves that may or may not be used to eating anything other than milk and pasture grass, you start throwing in a fermented feed, and that taste is gonna throw them off for a little bit until they get used to it. And intake is going to be one of the things that we've got to be concerned about when we wean these calves. These calves have got to eat, all right? They've got to eat and they've got to drink. And it needs to be a highly palatable ration that they're willing to consume. And when you start throwing in silages and baleages, and haylages in that first critical period after weaning, I think you're going to be disappointed with the intake and how the calves are going to perform.
Yeah. Okay, Ron, let's take a break here. When we come back, I want to start talking a little bit more about some of the methods of weaning. I realize there's a lot of folks that listen that have methods and have heard a lot of these, but we're going to go through that a little bit. And of course, the bottom line, you said it a little bit ago, the biggest thing is these calves need to eat and drink. And that's really what it's coming back to in a lot of this that we're trying to get them to minimize this stress. We're going to take a break. We'll be back. This segment today brought to you by the Mansaver Post Driver by Rohr Manufacturing, the portable, lightweight, and easy to use pneumatic post driver where the name speaks for itself. When it comes to building fence, driving those steel posts can be exhausting and absolutely backbreaking. But there is another way you could be doing this. Now, I'm not talking about those bulky and expensive gas-powered or hydraulic pounders. What I'm talking about is the Mansaver post driver. Yeah, it's called the Mansaver post driver by Roar Manufacturing. This is a portable, lightweight, easy-to-use post driver that runs off of any small air compressor and is 100% made in the USA. The Mansaver post driver comes in a variety of models, from driving posts ranging from vineyard stakes to T-posts and all the way up to 3.5-inch diameter posts. While it may be called the Mansaver post driver, shoot, I've heard some go as far as calling it the Marriage Saver post driver. But take a look for yourself. See it in action when you go to their website at roarmfg.com. That's ROHRERMFG.com. Or if you want to talk to a real person, give them a call at 800-980-7599. The Mansaver post driver, the portable, lightweight, and easy-to-use pneumatic post driver, where the name speaks for itself. All right, Dr. Ron Lemenager is my guest here today. He is the beef extension specialist for Purdue University, also a rancher, a producer himself. On our program here today, as we're talking about just the weaning time, minimizing that stress. It really comes down to the idea is if we can minimize this stress, we can keep more calves healthy, more calves going on. And at the price that these calves are at this year, it's a pretty big dollar value. All right, Ron, let's go on now. And I want you to work through us some of the methods of weaning.
People break this thing up in different ways. I like to break it up into two categories, and each of the categories has got kind of two sub pieces. The first one is abrupt weaning, all right, where you basically separate cows and calves. And one of the ways is to move the calves or the cows to a completely separate location. Mm-hmm. I like that procedure, and I'll talk more about that here in just a second. The second abrupt weaning method would be fence line weaning, where the calves and cows are separated and placed across the fence from each other. And then the second major category is kind of what I call the two-stage weaning. Mm-hmm. And the first piece of that could be some kind of a nursing prevention tool, all right? And we think of those nose flaps that you put into those calves' noses. The calves can remain with the cow, but they can't nurse. And the second two-stage weaning process that could be used, probably see it maybe more in seed stock operations where you got that special bull calf, or maybe you got a couple special heifers that you really want to baby through this whole process, and that's a twice-a-day nursing. So you separate the cows and calves, and you put them together twice a day and let the calf nurse, and then you re-separate them again. So let's talk a little bit about the abrupt weaning first, okay? This is a method that's probably used by a lot of producers that wean their calves and take them directly to the sale barn. Mm-hmm. All right. I mean, that's classic.
Yeah. Yep.
You go to the sale barn and you got a bunch of bawling babies, right? Mm-hmm. In my case, I like this method the best for my operation. And I think when you start thinking about these weaning methods, I think you've got to think about what's my management style. Okay, what resources do I have, okay, in terms of feed and facilities, and what's my labor situation, right? Mm-hmm. So I like the abrupt weaning in my operation. And so in our deal, the calves are creep fed for 30 to 45 days before weaning. So they get used to eating out of a feed bunk. They're also drinking out of a water tank, okay? So they're learning how to, what that is while they're still nursing mom. At weaning, cows stay in the same pasture that they've been in prior to weaning. Mm-hmm. Calves are loaded and moved, in my case, 9 miles away. And so in this case, the calves and the cows are out of sight and out of sound from each other. And I think that's probably, if you're going to do it this way, I think they need to be separated like that.
Okay.
Right? And, then what we do is we precondition those calves for 45 days. Okay. And so they can be ready then for placement either as a seed stock sale mm-hmm. or as a value-added feeder calf, okay, on the bottom end. So the second part of that abrupt weaning, okay, would be the fence line weaning. That's probably my low-stress preference if cows and calves cannot be separated by sight and sound.
Okay.
So if you're talking about one ranch headquarters where everything has got to take place right there, calves and cows can see and hear each other, I think the fence line weaning makes probably the most sense. And I think The advantage is that their separation anxiety is reduced because obviously they can see and hear each other, okay, across the fence, and they're going to do a lot less walking as a result of that. The stress really becomes the termination of milk intake, but not so much the physical separation of mom and baby, because they can nose each other across the fence. The disadvantage of that process is that fences have got to be capable of keeping that separation, right? So you've got to have good fences. Some producers like moving cows into a grassy dry lot or trap and keep the calves on the adjacent pastures. Others like putting the calves in the grassy dry lot and keeping the cows in the adjacent pasture. For me, the decision is really about the amount of dust in the dry lot.
Okay.
Right. So I want to minimize the respiratory problems of that weaned calf. And so the calf is going to be put into an area where the dust is the least of an issue. Right.
Yeah.
And so given a choice, I like the calves in a grassy lot near the handling facilities so I can get them in to treat them if I need to.
Yeah.
Right. But I think the dust thing is really the key factor there. In terms of the two-stage weaning process, let's talk a minute about the nose flaps.
Okay.
And it's also considered a low-stress option. The advantage of nose flaps is reduced calf anxiety at separation. The calf is now been weaned off of milk. Now it's got to get weaned off of mom. Okay, so that's now becomes the weaning stress. The disadvantages are the labor requirement to put the nose flaps in and take them out. And I have an additional concern that I've seen the lesions that those nose flaps can cause on the inside of the nose septum, and that takes a while to heal. So that's not my preferred method.
Okay.
But for those producers that can use that effectively and it works into their management style, I'm not opposed to it. I just have that concern about the lesions that it creates. Mm-hmm. The second two-stage method, is really letting those calves nurse twice a day. And the advantage is reduced stress on both the cow and the calf. So what's going to happen is the twice a day nursing is going to actually reduce milk production, milk flow.
Yeah.
And so whenever we do the hard wean, that cow's udder isn't going to be near as engorged with milk, and it's not going to be as discomfortable for her, right? Mm-hmm. So that can be kind of an advantage, right? The disadvantage is that it's fairly labor intensive to bring cows in. They'll probably come in fairly easy. It's a matter of getting them sorted back off twice a day. And I think the other part of it is whenever you're doing that twice a day nursing, so the period of separation of cows and calves, you need to make sure that the calves have access to clean, fresh water, good quality hay, and a palatable ration, because they're no longer able to maybe graze as effectively, all right, depending on the lot you put them in. And they sure need water and nourishment. So I think that there's no one size method that fits all. Producers need to utilize a method that kind of fits their management style, their facilities, and their labor resources. And really the goal ultimately is to minimize stress as much as possible for both the cow and the calf.
Yeah, right there. You just summed up what I was going to go back again and hit that, because you'd said that earlier. Do a method that fits your style, your management style, your resources, and your labor. Now, some might argue and say, well, maybe you need to reevaluate your style in terms of how you move forward in your cattle operating. But nevertheless, I think that's something, when you talk about your resources, feed, facilities, and labor, I felt sometimes even in our own operation, we've done certain weaning, and maybe in the past few years, we've done certain weaning methods that maybe doesn't fit our resources. When I say resources, I'm probably talking more feed, because we've been kind of in a drought situation. And one of the things that you hit on, and you just keep talking about this, is that one of the things that is imperative is that these calves are on good water. And then number two, they're on good feed. And, when we're in a drought situation, that's kind of what we don't have if we're a range operation.
Yeah, and the only good piece of that is that these calves that are just weaned, are not eating a heck of a lot of feed, right? I mean, it's not like feeding a feedlot steer or feeding a cow, right? So 10 pounds of feed goes a long ways when you're feeding calves. But it's got to be cost effective. And with calves that are over $3 a pound, it seems like to me that the economics is kind of in the favor of putting some weight on these calves, even though feed prices might be a little higher than you'd like.
Yeah. Okay, Ron, let's take another break here. When we come back, we've got a couple more things I want to talk about. That is health and also early weaning and some things along those conversations that we'll have along those two topics. We're going to take a break here, but first, here is the Captain Tim O'Byrne with more.
Hey everybody, Tim here. We're fixing to come up on 1 million downloads of our Working Ranch radio show podcast, which is really exciting. And it got me to thinking about another viral moment that we had back in 2017 when we ran a short Facebook video of the safety zone calf catchers. And it was so popular, it got 6.8 million views in the first 5 days. I want you folks to check it out, Safety Zone Calf Catchers. It's a great product for all producers. Keep you safe when you're working with baby calves, especially for old timers like me who maybe can't outrun those cows anymore. Check them out, Safety Zone Calf Catchers.
Calving season is a favorite time of year, but along with that special time are dangers, extra stress, and increased labor. Safety Zone Calf Catchers are all about safety and making processing new calves easier. Designed for ATVs or UTVs, one person can do the job and never be threatened by the protective mother cow. Make this and every calving season safer and easier with a Safety Zone Calf Catcher. Watch videos and customer testimonials or order yours today at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505-0914. Affordable and made in the USA. Make your upcoming and all future calving seasons safer, easier, and stress-free. Durable and designed to work anywhere you can drive your ATV or UTV. Order online at safetyzonecalfcatchers.com or call 877-505-0914 today.
Okay, let's continue on in our conversation here as we're talking about minimizing weaning stress overall and just keeping these calves healthy as we look ahead for those that do desire to wean calves this year. Ron, let's talk nutrition. I know that's kind of in your wheelhouse all along in this. And of course, as we were talking about in the last segment, how important good feed was. So let's work down this trail of good nutrition.
Well, and I guess I'm going to circle back to maybe some things that I kind of already talked about. But I think, training these calves pre-weaning to eat from a feed bunk and drink from a water supply that will be used after weaning, I think is sure one of the pieces of this nutrition program, and making sure the water is fresh, clean, and easily accessible. And when I say easily accessible, if we got a water that these calves can't reach, or we've got a water tank that, is half full, you got to think about the length of the calf's neck and how far they can reach. And so making sure that the water is accessible to those calves. And, you're going to have calves that are going to span maybe the 650 pound range, but you may have some 400 pounders if you're weaning all at the same time. And just making sure that the calves can all get access to that water supply is another key piece in my mind. And then we've talked about good quality grass hay and a palatable, high quality feed. And like I said, I like to wean these calves on a highly digestible fiber source like soybean hulls or gluten or distiller's grains with a minimum amount of grain input into that. And I like adding the ionophore, like something like Rumensin to stabilize intake and do some things that'll help me on the rumen health and gut health perspective. Mm-hmm. And I like using the ration, particularly if I have creep fed, just carrying that creep ration forward, into that transition through weaning. And then once the calves have been weaned, then I think you've got a lot of options of maybe adding some additional starch. And there's some reasons to add starch at this point, okay, after the calves have weaned, because we have in that 7 to 9 month window. Actually, it starts before weaning, but, if we're weaning at 7 months, roughly, up to about 9 months, that becomes a marbling window.
Oh, really?
And so if we can add starch to the diet, we can add those what we call pre-adipocytes, which is the fat cells that will ultimately become marbling in fill. Right. And so if I'm taking cattle I'm selling value-added cattle to a feedlot, and those cattle perform better on the rail because they marble better. And obviously there are premiums for upper 2/3 choice and prime kind of cattle right now. If I could add a little bit of marbling potential to those calves, or I'm actually not marbling potential. You're allowing those calves to express their genetic potential for marbling.
Okay. Very good. Yeah, that makes sense.
And so I think adding some corn after those calves have got through the weaning process, adding some corn or other starch containing grains can be of some value in terms of improving the marbling scores of those calves, at the end point. And if you've got some bulls, for example, that you're going to do some ultrasounding on, and you're going to be marketing bulls based on their marbling potential, that kind of makes some sense. I don't know that it makes sense for a replacement heifer going back into the cow herd, because it's not going to carry on to her calves. I mean, it's not a genetic thing, right?
Yeah.
It's just allowing the genetics to be expressed in the individual calf that's going to be evaluated, right? So if the calves are not going to be creep fed prior to weaning, providing a free choice long stem grass hay, and gradually introducing a palatable, highly digestible fiber ration over several days, and I would say that it would include an ionophore, right? And we know that feed intake is going to be low at first, but will increase as the stress of weaning diminishes. And so the ration should contain probably something in the neighborhood of 65% TDN and 14 to 16% crude protein.
Okay.
And so you can work with a nutritionist to kind of help put together that diet, that will minimize digestive upsets and still meet the requirements. The other part of this is that we need to really consider trace minerals, as being part of this formulation. And I would say especially copper, selenium, zinc, and manganese. And each one of those trace minerals can come in a chelated form or a hydroxy form of mineral, as opposed to the inorganic, so the sulfates, the chlorides, that kind of thing. This is probably one place where the chelated or the hydroxy mineral forms could be of some value, because they're more available to the animal. Right. And one of the things that we know is that the immune function is highly dependent on mineral status. All right. Minerals are cofactors for many of the metabolic pathways. And so make sure that you've got a good mineral program associated with these weaning rations. When corn and corn byproducts are put into the ration, like corn gluten and distillers grains, make sure to check the calcium to phosphorus ratio to prevent urinary calculi. I've had producers that have had the problem. And so it's real simple to correct, but calcium has always got to be higher than the phosphorus content. And whenever you're feeding corn byproducts, they bring a lot of phosphorus to the table, and I've got to balance that up. So again, checking with a nutritionist, to make sure that you've got all the nutrients provided in the correct amounts and in the correct ratios.
Yeah. One of the things as you were talking about there, and you just hit that at the very end, it made me think about this, because it's really not complicated to do this. And that is, if you do plan on weaning and have whatever you're planning to wean on, it would be very, very valuable to sit with a nutritionist, go through that. There's a lot at stake here. And I think in a way you can't afford not to.
Yeah. And that nutritionist might be your state extension specialist, your beef cattle specialist. It might be your local extension educator. Your local extension educator can put you in the right direction.
Sure.
All right. Of somebody that can help you to make sure that you don't get into trouble. It looked good on paper, but the reality was that, I was a little bit off on my calcium to phosphorus ratio, got urinary calculi. I ruined a bunch of bulls, or steers or whatever. And so it can be pretty cost effective.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a break here and we'll continue on. We're talking weaning here today. My guest is Dr. Ron Lemenager. He is the beef extension specialist, also a beef producer himself, but he is out of Purdue University. And when we come back, we've got a couple more things we need to talk about. One is health, and then we're also going to be talking early weaning. So stick with us here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. This segment today brought to you by Allflex. It all starts with a tag, the most trusted portfolio of ID solutions.
It all starts with a tag. Identifying each animal allows you to better manage the entire herd and control your operation's future. For nearly 70 years, producers have chosen Allflex for individual animal management. With AllFlex, you get the most trusted portfolio of ID solutions. Whether you need stock or custom visual tags, electronic tags, tissue sampling units for DNA collection, or syringes, bring the AllFlex advantage to your operation today. Visit allflexusa.com to learn more.
As we continue on here, we got a couple more things that we need to talk about. Let's talk about health. Really, at the end of it, this all comes down to making sure that these calves are staying healthy, being able to be cognizant as a rancher, being aware of what's going on, seeing what's going on in that bunch. I know for our own operation, that's something we feel has been a little bit of our weakness, is not catching these calves in time. And of course, too late means either dead or just not being able to get them pulled back together so they make the truck. So let's talk about the importance of health in this.
Well, I'm going to start out by saying I highly recommend working with your local veterinarian, okay, to establish a weaning health protocol well in advance of the actual weaning process so that you can do the pre-weaning vaccinations and all that kind of stuff. And our goal here is really to create a robust immune system in the calf prior to the stresses associated with the weaning process so that they stay healthy. Okay, not only in that early post-weaning period, but all the way on through the feedlot, right, or this background stocker operations. Planning prior to weaning, in my mind, is critical, all right? Ideally, calves should be vaccinated 2 to 4 weeks before weaning with a booster vaccine at weaning. And it takes about 2 weeks for a vaccine to create a good immune response. All right. So if you're weaning and you're vaccinating for the first time, those calves are not very well protected during that critical weaning stress period. And so there's logic behind pre-weaning vaccination and then follow up with a booster at weaning time. The primary diseases that I think producers need to consider, and again, working with your veterinarian, you can fine tune this, but I think that viruses are the primary cause of sickness. And so if I can control the viruses, chances are I won't get the secondary bacterial infections. All right. So the viruses that I'm concerned about is IBR, so infectious bovine rhinotracheitis, BVD or bovine viral diarrhea, both types 1 and 2, PI3 or parainfluenza, and BRSV, which is bovine respiratory syncytial virus. And I would also add to that the bacterial of Clostridia. So a good 7-way Clostridia, in some cases, maybe an 8-way, depending on where you're at in the country and what your veterinarian recommends. Other bacterial infections are typically secondary to the viral infections, and some operations may need to consider bacterial vaccines for Mannheim hemolytica, Pasteurella multicauda, and Mycoplasma bovis. But I think to make a blanket recommendation for everybody to use those, okay, is probably not appropriate, but it sure would be appropriate for some operations that have had certain challenges in the past. Retrospectively, you need to kind of think about, how easy was it to treat my respiratory problems, okay, in the past, and what did I treat with, and how successful was all that? And so maybe adding something else to your vaccination strategy may be of some value, and working with your veterinarian, I think, is a key piece to that.
Yeah. I have a quick question in regards to, you were talking about the vaccinations. A lot of our operations, like where we're at here, is we'll do a shot and vaccinations at branding time and then at preconditioning, and not necessarily one at weaning time.
Well, the way I look at this is it kind of depends on what vaccines you're given.
Okay.
All right. So if you're doing the viruses and you're using a modified live, you have a pretty big window between an acceptable window between the first vaccine and the booster vaccine.
Okay.
If you're using a killed vaccine, that window tightens up. Okay. And you're really looking at the booster needs to be 3, probably no more than 4 weeks away from that initial dose. So it also depends a little bit on how well vaccinated your cow herd is, okay, as to which vaccines you use. All right.
Okay.
There are some vaccines that are on the market that I can use a modified live on the calf without having causing abortion in my cows.
Yes.
Okay. If the cow herd is really, really well vaccinated, which is a topic unto itself, okay, we're not covering that today, but If the cow herd is well vaccinated, then I can use a modified live vaccine on the calf while it's still nursing mom. Be careful about which products you use. All right.
Okay.
And here again, work with your veterinarian, because some of them, there's one in particular that does not shed. Okay. Once the calf is vaccinated with the modified live, the calf doesn't shed the virus, okay, to contaminate the cow or infect the cow. There are others where the calf does shed, okay, and a poorly vaccinated cow could abort because of the shedding of the virus. So this is where it's really critical in my mind to work with your veterinarian to find out what's best for your operation. The other one piece of this whole health thing is that you need parasite control, both internal and external. So I like the dewormers that can control the inhibited stages of Ostratagia, which is the brown stomach worm. So they have kind of that residual effect. On the externals, we're talking about lice, we're talking about flies, we're talking about ticks. And in some parts of the country, this Asian longhorn tick has become a real problem. And so, making sure that you use the right products to be able to control those, because those ticks can actually kill a cow, okay, or kill a calf by anemia. All right, they just suck the blood dry. So that becomes another piece of, I think, your herd health protocol. If calves are going to get sick after weaning, it's probably going to be in first 7 to 10 days, okay, after weaning. And so I think close observation to monitor calf health is especially critical in the first 2 weeks. Be observant of, how active is the calf? Okay, what's the position of the ears? Are they drooping? Are they upright and erect? Eye brightness, nasal discharge, coughing, lameness. And I'm going to throw in there manure consistency. If these calves are in a diarrhea state, or are they, defecating, these little bricks. And they need to be somewhere in between those two extremes. Okay, they can be a little bit loose, but the color is good. Okay, I'm not too concerned about that. But when it starts to go to watery, runny, being able to go through a screen door, that becomes a real problem. Okay, and electrolytes may need to be, again, something that's in your arsenal. Okay, in your medicine cabinet. Again, working with your veterinarian to establish a health treatment protocol. What do I use first? Okay, in a calf that has this symptom. Which antibiotic, which electrolyte, okay, which anti-inflammatory, like something like a Banamine, whatever. But get that in place so that, you can quickly respond to a calf that's starting to go downhill. And the earlier you get them treated, the faster the recovery.
Yeah.
And it's going to be the cheapest way, because if you got to come back and retreat, that calf has the potential of becoming a chronic.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, Ron, let's take another break here. When we come back, we've got one more topic that I want to hit as we are in the subject of talking about weaning here today, and that is early weaning. And we'll do that when we come back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. This segment today brought to you by the American Gelbvieh Association. Meet modern industry demands for feedlots and carcass traits with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics. Find out more at gelbvieh.org.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Gelbvieh and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Gelbvieh and Balancer influence females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, Balancer influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. This year, make your crossbreeding count with Gelbvieh and Balancer Genetics.
Okay, let's get to our final thing here today. And as at the break, I was talking with you about how I thought your previous conversation about the marbling window was fascinating. It's something I hadn't heard before, but it kind of ties a little bit in here as we talk about early weaning and the rations that are associated with that. But let's talk about early weaning.
Okay. Well, obviously calves are typically weaned at about 7 months of age. At that point, calves are consuming primarily forage and maybe some creep feed if it's provided. But cow's milk probably represents about 20% or less of the nutrient intake of that calf, okay, at about 7 months. At 5 months, maybe it's contributing 30%. So, the milk production is going down. Calf intake of nutrients from milk is going down. And so early weaning can actually be done successfully and opportunistically when there's a limited forage resource available. In other words, we typically think, our minds typically go to a drought situation, all right?
Mm-hmm.
But the other one would be when I've got young cows that are getting thin. All
Sure.
right. So that first calf heifer maybe has done a really good job of weaning that, 600-pound bull calf. Okay. And she's thin. All right. If I could pull that calf off just maybe a little bit earlier, give that cow a chance to, gain some weight and condition when our nutrient requirements are actually the lowest. All right. Because that cow would be probably in her mid-third of pregnancy. Okay. Requirements for that fetal growth is minimal at that point. And so anything that a cow eats, it goes to maintenance and accumulating some weight and gain and some body condition. So we often think about early weaning in that 150 to 180 day age range.
Yeah.
Okay. I typically wean at about 6 months.
Okay.
5.5 to 6 months, but we could wean calves as early as 70 days. I do not recommend weaning calves younger than 70 days. And the reason for that is we've done some research with that. And at less than 70 days of age, these calves' rumens are not quite functional yet. They're not mature enough to be able to handle post-weaning rations at that point. And what you end up with is a calf that kind of is pot-bellied and orphan looking.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so 70 days is kind of my target, okay, for the young side. And so we kind of talked about early weaning, cow requirements go down, but also the dry matter intake of that cow goes down. You also take away any grazing that the calf would do out on pasture and the trampling losses, okay, associated with those calf feet all over the pasture. And so early weaning, in my mind, can extend a short forage supply by at least a third.
Okay. Wow.
Maybe more.
That's a lot.
Right? And so if I'm in a drought situation, it is sure something to seriously consider. This allows these particularly the spring calving cow herd, to go into the winter a half to one body condition score heavier than they would have if I'd left the calf on, to normal weaning. And I think that's the real advantage to, extending my forage supply and the increased weight and condition going into the winter. And if the cows end up going from a 5 to a 6 going into the winter, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if I get a really, really cold winter and these cows start to slip a little bit, as long as I don't slip below 5, I'm still in pretty good shape in terms of those cows returning to estrus after they calve and conception rates, right? So I can use that excess body condition kind of as a pseudo supplement, during some critical times, right? So when you're dealing with early wean rations, I think it's important that you work with a nutritionist, okay? And this is maybe even more important here than it was in a traditional weaning ration, because these early wean calves are going to have really low intakes when you wean them. Whether they are creep fed or not, intake is going to be fairly low. And this is probably where some grain in the ration kind of fits in an early wean ration, because I've got to increase the energy density because of low intakes, and I've got to use a all natural protein supply. All right. So something like a soybean meal or a distiller's grains, where it's all natural protein, and not make sure you stay away from the ureas and those kinds of containing supplements, because those calves can't use it very well. And so kind of my target protein levels for those is at least 16%. All right.
Okay.
And again, it's making it more nutrient dense because of the low intake. And then once we get through the weaning stress, the calves are eating normal, then you can start to make some rations that are more typical of that post-weaning period.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, I'll tell you what, Ron, a lot here through this, some very good information. I think this is one of these types of shows that is going to get rewound and listened through as they hear that again. So just some final comments from you as we talk about this weaning. And of course, we keep hitting it. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but anytime we wean and we're in any calf market, it's important to do the right thing and do it well. But when these calves are selling for $2,000 a head and more, it's even a bigger deal this year, isn't it?
Yep. I'm gonna wrap it up and say, I think the keys to a successful weaning program are reducing stress, maintaining a good nutrition program, supporting the calf's immune system, and getting calves to perform at a profitable level.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a good way to wrap it up here. Thanks for joining us here today on the program. Very, very good knowledge to pass along. Appreciate you being here on the program.
My pleasure. Anytime.
You bet. And again, my guest today, Dr. Ron Lemenager. He is the beef extension specialist out of Purdue University. And as you kind of gathered along there too, he also raises cattle. So speaking from experience, appreciate his take on this, on a subject that I think a lot of folks are going to be looking at a little bit this year. And I think it's timely due in the fact that if some are not already getting ready to wean, if they're planning to do that this year, might be looking ahead and thinking about the process as well. And maybe some pointers here today in our program that you'll find very valuable. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'll tell you what's in store for next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. But this segment today brought to you by Tank Toad, your remote water monitoring system, all from the convenience of your phone. If you would like to keep track of your water supply and get ahead of the wreck before it happens, do what we've been doing for the last several years, and that is using a remote water monitoring system from Tank Toad, all from the convenience of your phone. Whether you've got a good cell connection or you're in a remote area, they've got ways to do that through satellite and or cell. Of course, they're solar powered as well. Keep an eye on your water supply with a daily text message. If you'd like to find out more, give Meadowlark Solutions a call at 801-252-6135, or you can find out more online at tanktoad.com. Tank monitors, well controllers, generators, and more. Find out more. Again, that website is tanktoad.com.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the WeatherStationExperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit MeasureRain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to MeasureRain.com.
Hey, just a reminder, if you're listening here on the radio today and you missed something that we talked about, you can find all of today's show and its episodes and all the previous shows that we've had here on the Working Ranch Radio Show by going to our podcast site, which is workingranchradio.com, or if you have a preferred podcast provider, you can find it there as well. And just like today's show where we were talking about keys to successful weaning, a lot of the shows we have are topics that are relevant no matter when they aired. And if it's on a certain subject that you would like more information about, I encourage you to go find different shows that we've had at our podcast site or your preferred podcast provider. Download it, take a listen. And if you have questions, comments, ideas for shows, feel free to send me an email. My email address is justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Now, coming up on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show, like I said earlier in the program today, we're going to be talking drones, and they're not necessarily the little ones. This is more the big type, the ones that are aerial applicators, but how it can be used in the ranching business. So that's coming up on next week's edition of the Working Ranch Radio Show. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about 10 reasons why you would not hay. I know that's going to perk a few folks' ears up a little bit, so tune in a couple of weeks to hear how that show goes. Before we head out here today, a quick thank you to our sponsors of the Working Ranch Radio Show, Allflex. It all starts with a tag. Mansaver Post Driver by Roar Manufacturing, Safety Zone Calf Catcher, the American Gelbvieh Association, and Tank Toad, your remote water monitoring system, all from the convenience of your phone. Hey, thanks for joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show, which is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.